All right. Thank you all for attending. We're going to go ahead and get started. So this is Thinking Differently, the new passkey threat model v2.0. And my name is Mud, because I forgot my, there we go. I got a clicker, so now I can actually move forward. My name is Dean Sachs. I am a senior security engineer with AWS Identity. I am also the co-chair of the FIDO Alliance's Enterprise Deployment Working Group. And I've been engaged in the FIDO Alliance for over 7 years now. I've helped build hardware products based on FIDO within Amazon. I've helped teams roll out software to support FIDO at various Amazon products. And I'm here to talk to you today again about passkeys. And so if you were here at Identiverse last year, show of hands, who was here at Identiverse last year? Great. You heard me talk about passkeys and the passkey threat model. And when we talked about the passkey threat model last year, I used this Venn diagram. And this Venn diagram was a great way for us to examine the universe of FIDO discoverable credentials, what you call passkeys. And we use this Venn diagram to describe the similarities and the differences between these passkeys, because understanding the differences is critically important to understanding how we can use passkeys in our environments securely. As a security engineer, I truly believe that if you don't understand these differences, you will make a mistake in your deployment, and that mistake may be harmful to you or your customers. And so what I want you to take out of today is a positive message. You should be using passkeys. Passkeys are better than passwords. But passkeys are not risk-free. And that's the thing that you have to keep in mind when rolling out passkeys. So when we looked at this Venn diagram, we talked about the similarities, the fact that these are all cryptographic key pairs, they're origin-bound, they're highly phishing resistant, they're generally password replacements. Sometimes they're used as second factors. Both are valid use cases. Do not let anyone fool you into thinking that you must use a passkey as a password replacement only. It can be used as a password replacement. It can be used as part of a second factor, of a two-factor flow with a second factor. That second factor might be a password. And all passkeys, all RPs I should say, need to provide some mechanism for account recovery, because there are ways in which we can lose our passkeys, but they're different depending on whether they are device-bound or synced. And so when we look at a device-bound credentials are bound into a hardware device like a YubiKey or a Talis key or a key from the Google Titan key. They're bound to a trusted execution environment, a TPM, or a secure element. And these are unrecoverable if lost, because this is tightly bound to this hardware device. So if I'm out paddleboarding in Puget Sound, I live in the Seattle area, if I'm paddleboarding in Puget Sound and I throw my YubiKey overboard and it falls to the bottom of the sound, I'm not going to recover it. I'm not going to recover those credentials unless Sarah's going to go scuba diving for me to go find the thing. But on the other hand, we have synced passkeys. And synced passkeys bring us high levels of availability. And that availability comes from the fact that they are not bound to a device. They are synced across a cloud and available on multiple devices. So if instead of throwing my YubiKey into the sound, I throw my iPhone into the sound, I go home and I pick up my laptop, I've still got all my credentials. I buy a new iPhone, I bootstrap it with my provider, and I have all my credentials. And this is great. But this is only because the key material is exportable. But exportability creates new risks, such as credential sharing. And there are multiple mechanisms by which we can share credentials, such as through Apple's AirDrop mechanism, where I can share it with somebody in close proximity to me over Bluetooth. I can also share through my passkey managers. Many of the passkey managers support sharing amongst your family members or friends, whomever's within that particular ecosystem. And we'll talk about some more mechanisms a little bit later. But the most important thing about passkeys is this credential recovery part, that high availability part that synced passkeys bring over device-bound passkeys. So 6 months ago, as I was thinking about writing this talk, I was thinking, okay, cool, here's all the fun things that are coming in the ecosystem this year. I'll have so much content to talk about, and TLDR, not much happened. But actually quite a bit happened. It was just small events. But those small events have big impacts. So the first one is January of last year. If you heard Andrew's talk this morning, January of 2023, synced passkeys became real. They became available on many of the platforms. In the fall of last year, September or so of 2023, we started seeing third-party passkey providers come on board as well. This is the 1Password, Dashlane, Bitwarden, Proton Pass, you name it. And as of this morning, there was a new one added this morning, there are 24 known synced passkey providers in the Passkey Authenticator AA GUID, that's a mouthful, database. And this is a database maintained by Tim Capali on GitHub, and it has the self-asserted AA GUIDs of these passkey providers. Now, the self-asserted part is really important here. If you saw the talk last year, you know that this is a mechanism to allow you to determine this looks like a passkey from 1Password, and I can therefore maybe use a 1Password logo, or I can tag it with a 1Password identifier, but it's not a security control because there's no attestation, as Danny just talked about, on that credential to prove that that AA GUID belongs to that particular provider. But the good news is we now have passkey providers on virtually every platform, every OS, pretty much everywhere where you can do your work. And so this shows great growth in the marketplace. There's great interest in this. And of course, we've seen great growth in the number of RPs supporting passkeys today. So the second thing that happened is that the passkey provider sync certification is coming to life. And so we started working on this last year through the Security and Privacy Working Group at FIDO, and it's now moved on to the Certification Working Group to build the certification program. But this is a certification program that will certify passkey providers to a baseline level of security. This is not a super high level of security. This is the lowest level, and this is similar to how other certification programs in FIDO have rolled out. For hardware keys, for instance, you have L1 certification, which is the lowest level, and you go up from there, L1 plus, L2, and beyond. And they each represent different sets of security properties on those keys. But this baseline is important because it's assigned to the market, to the consumer, that a passkey provider is certified and meets some basic definitions of security as provided by the Alliance. It is not something that can be discovered by the relying party. The relying party has no way in today's ecosystem to discover this because there is no method to communicate the status of the security certification onward to the RP. And finally, no provider is required to participate. But I think the most significant thing that's happened this year happened about a month ago. And thankfully, it happened a month before Identiverse and not a week before Identiverse because it gave me time to rewrite my deck from the top to bottom. And you can ask Eve, I shared my deck early in April, and it is a completely different deck now. But this passkey guidance by NIST was a supplemental update to 863-3, and I recognize there is a mistake on here. It's not SB 806-33. But this addressed synchronized credentials. Broadly speaking, we're talking about passkeys here, and it was great to see this guidance come out. But the problem was, much of the press that I saw about this guidance was, synced passkeys are AAL2, yay! And that's not the case. Synced passkeys may be AAL2, but are not always AAL2, and we need to understand why. So, what does NIST have to say about passkeys? And I'm saying this as Ryan Galuzzo, the author, is sitting over here looking at me and staring me down. So this is going to be fun. So I'm going to give you my version of what NIST has to say about passkeys based on my reading. And Ryan and I have spoken about this a little bit. But I want to start sort of from the end of the document and kind of work backwards, just because it works better in the slides this way. So first I want to start with some federal guidance. And this is for the federal government offering public services. And NIST says attestations should not be used for broad public-facing applications. And the reasoning is sound. Attestations are not available everywhere, and if you block credentials that do not carry an attestation at registration time, you will force your users into using weaker credentials such as SMS OTP and passwords. And that's not the outcome that we want. So broadly, I agree with this guidance, except for two little words: should not. I think this is an area that we need to think more carefully, and instead of saying we should not use attestations, we should accept attestations when they are made available to us as the RP. Because if I accept an attestation and I process that attestation and I learn security properties of that particular passkey provider or particular authenticator from that attestation, that gets injected into my risk engine and can be used as part of my risk analysis at the sign-in time. Because you're not all dropping your risk engines just because you're moving to passkeys, right? They're a better credential, but they're not risk-free. So the second piece of guidance I want to point out here is this nice table, which has, I think it's 5 different guidelines that are mapped to AAL1, 2, and 3 in the 863 doc. But here it just maps it out for AAL2. And one in particular is interesting to me. And this is the one that says authentication intent. I have to go over here to read it because the confidence monitor is pretty small today. So this guidance says that at AAL2, authentication intent is recommended. And it also says that it is achieved by syncable authenticators today because they require the users to enter an activation secret, that's your PIN, your biometric, etc., in order to perform the cryptographic authentication event or registration event. And this represents what we would call, in the FIDO land, user verification. User verification is the process by which an authenticator locally authorizes invocation of these two events. It may use a fingerprint, may use a PIN, may use a password, but broadly speaking, you have to enter some kind of credential in order to unlock the authenticator and ask it to perform the action on your behalf. But the reality is messy. And this is pulled directly from passkeys.dev, which is a great resource I highly recommend you take a look at. It's maintained by Tim Capali and the community in the WebAuthn community group. And this shows us that many of these authenticators don't actually respect the UV setting. So I'm a 1Password user. And when I unlock 1Password at T0, and then 9 minutes later I want to log into, say, my Google account with a passkey, the only thing I have to do is click the button and say, log in. I don't have to enter user intent. Now, this does not make these 1Password in this case, this does not make 1Password not AAL2 compatible because it's only a recommended control. But it is a place where we need to do continued work to improve the state of how we handle these situations. And there is work happening in the WebAuthn working group right now to address the issue of caching of these user intent gestures so that the RP can understand when user intent happened. It may not have happened at the immediate moment of authentication, but it may have happened a few minutes in the past. Continuing on with their guidance, NIST guidance includes a statement that says, private keys that are cloned or exported from a device shall only be stored in an encrypted form. Now this makes sense, and I don't think anyone could argue with this guidance. Because unencrypted export has bad outcomes. Theft of those clear text credentials. We know this occurs. We see it in all different kinds of realms, whether it's access keys for your various online services or passwords that you're storing in clear text. Or the ability to socially engineer this unphishable credential out of the user. Because the user themselves are not unphishable. The credential might be, but if you can still phish it out of the user by convincing them to do the thing that's not in their interest, that's a bad outcome. And the reality is that multiple providers today allow unencrypted passkey export. This includes ProtonPass, Bitwarden, and KeePassXC. And there's a great thread on the GitHub issues for KeePassXC where Tim Capali and I got into it a bit with the developers. I encourage you to look at it, and eventually it just heads downhill and descends into madness. But suffice it to say, there are reasons why we shouldn't do key export in clear text. And frankly, key export is creepy. And you'll understand this joke in a moment. So the FIDO Alliance and its partners are working on a credential manager migration standard that up until last week was called CREEP. Unfortunately, as with all things in identity, naming is the hardest thing that we have to do, and so it's been renamed to something that I can't remember, but I think it's Universal Credential Exchange, or UCX, and the format is Universal Credential Exchange Format, UCXF, a mouthful. So CREEP will allow passkey managers to do an encrypted migration of those credentials between the providers. So 1Password to Dashlane to ProtonPass to KeePassXC. Obviously, it depends on who implements this, and I'm not claiming anyone in particular is implementing this. But last week in Osaka at the FIDO Alliance meeting, we discussed Creep, and you will be hearing more about it soon. It should be moving to a working draft, publicly available, so that you too can see how the Creep protocol will work. Now, the challenge with this is that RPs cannot discover that credentials have migrated from one passkey provider to another. And so if you think passkey provider A is secure and passkey provider B is less secure, but you can't discover that passkey has migrated from one to another, and in fact you can't yet discover in most cases that the passkey exists in passkey provider A, then you really don't know where this thing exists at any point in time. Now, there are changes coming to the ecosystem that will address this, will allow us to understand whether it's been seen from this device before or whether it's moved credential managers, but those tools do not exist today in the ecosystem. The guidance continues to say user access to private keys in the sync fabric shall be protected by an AAL2 equivalent MFA. Again, I love this guidance. This is correct, and this is exactly what I've been advocating for within the FIDO Alliance when we talked about the security and privacy requirements for the baseline security certification. But we need to focus on this because at AAL2, authentication shall occur by either multi-factor authentication or a combination of two single-factor authenticators. But the reality is really different. So this is an image of ProtonPass, and I'm sorry, this may be a little hard for you to see in the back, but I'm going to play this video. And what you're going to see is I'm logging into my personal ProtonPass account. I'm filling it in with my password manager, and the password that I'm using here is password. That's not a good password at all. So they're not even following the baseline NIST recommendations for handling passwords, not using known breached or weak passwords. But then as I log into ProtonPass, you can see with this password, I have my passkey here, and this is for WebAuthn.me. It's not a very useful passkey, and please don't try and log into my ProtonPass account. There's nothing in there for you or for me, because it's not the one that I choose to use. So this is a real problem, because if I cannot distinguish which passkey provider is being used, then I have to assume the weakest possible combination of factors at that passkey provider. Come on. So I said this last year, and I'll repeat it again this year. FIDO credentials without attestation lack provable security properties. As Danny was saying earlier, it doesn't mean that they're not secure. It doesn't mean that they're not phishing resistant. It doesn't mean that they can't be exported. It doesn't mean anything if I can't prove the state of that particular credential. And this is a significant problem. But every time I say this, I get this question. But wait, Dean, why are passkey providers different than password managers? Aren't they the same thing? Well, no, they're not. They're different. And it comes down to choice. So first, users can choose to use or not use a password manager. And in the United States today, as of a study done in 2023 by security.org, 34% of users are using a password manager. 41% of users in the United States are memorizing all of their passwords, and 21% are using the same password on most, if not all, sites. And so this is a horrible, horrible state of affairs. The reality today is that if you choose to use a password manager every single time, and you choose to use that password manager correctly to create strong, long passwords that are unique and have never been seen in a breach, then you are raising the bar over the status today. This is not to say that you shouldn't move to passkeys instead of passwords, but we can improve the state of security simply by getting users to use the tools available to them, which increase their security posture. Passkeys, on the other hand, force users into a passkey provider ecosystem. A small portion of users will buy hardware keys, but they're relatively expensive. And when I can get a passkey manager for free with my operating system or my browser, why am I going to go pay for these hardware keys unless I have a high security need or other reasons why I choose not to do that? So now we have better credentials, passkeys, and they're highly centralized in a couple of different services. And that makes a really nice honeypot for attackers. And at scale, virtually every user will have a passkey provider, or more than likely, every user will have more than one passkey provider, because I've already seen this in examples where people wind up having passkeys stuffed into Chrome, stuffed into iCloud, 1Password, etc. And that's going to be the state of play for a while until this market settles down. The challenge here is that security varies by provider for both passwords and passkeys. But the difference comes down to the trust model. So the trust model for passwords is based upon entropy and uniqueness, or secrecy. It's never been seen before in a breach, and it's reasonably long and has enough entropy to be considered secure. So with passkeys, the trust model is now dependent upon the provider and the provider's properties. The strongest unidentifiable passkey provider is as risky as the weakest passkey provider from the relying party's perspective when they cannot be identified individually. And this comes down to questions about storage and synchronization, authentication to the passkey provider and account recovery with the passkey provider, access control within the passkey provider, and the ability to do export and sharing, such as the clear text export from ProtonPass. So I'll go back to my statement that FIDO credentials without attestation lack provable security properties. And if we go back to the Venn diagram from last year I had a testable down at the bottom, sort of outside of both the both sets of device-bound and synced passkeys. But now I'm going to move it. I'm going to move it into the center because there are limited instances of the availability of attestations on synced passkeys. But those are only available for enterprise attestations. They're only available in the enterprise market. And so for consumers, there's no attestation. And with no attestation, we're not going to be AAL2. So if you're a consumer service using passkeys today, they are a fantastic password replacement. But they are probably not an MFA replacement. And you may want to still use a second factor with your passkey unless you have an attestation that tells you its security properties. Now, for many sites, like /.org, I probably don't care about attestation. I probably don't care about necessarily the security properties of the passkey. But if I'm a banking site or involved in healthcare or insurance or have any sort of fiduciary duty to my customers, then I probably care, and maybe I care a lot. And I think we're starting to see some of this through some of the conversations I've had with my peers in the FIDO Alliance. So with that, I'll leave some time for Q&A. But again, I do want to recommend, don't stop your passkey deployments just because of these threats. But be aware of these threats, be cognizant of how they impact your business, and think about how you can control these threats, such as by using those risk engines that you've already got in place for passwords today. Don't turn them off. Don't push them away. You're still going to need those in a passkey world. It is only when we can get the strong attested properties of those passkeys that we can really begin to trust them, not only as a first factor, but also as a multi-factor authenticator as well. And with that, I'll open it up for Q&A. Thank you. Go ahead, Sebastian.
Yeah. Coming back to your example where you were paddleboarding across the Sound.
Yeah.
Now, I have the privilege of owning a hardware token that I can store them on. But what are the chances? What are the capabilities of, backing myself up here? So how
There's
do
no
I make
possibility. So when it's a hardware-bound credential, It can't be backed up. It can't be migrated off that. And that means that you have a second credential or a third. So, for instance, at home, I have a bucket of YubiKeys and other kinds of keys sitting on my desk. I've probably shown it to people on various phone calls. But I have a whole series of keys that I use. And I keep one in my laptop. I keep one in my fireproof safe at home. And I keep one in a safe deposit box because that's my emergency backup to gain access to my passkey providers.
Okay, but that means I need to re-enroll with all those keys at the same service, and the service needs me to allow to do that, right?
Which is why synced passkeys are a beautiful thing, because they reduce that burden on the user, right? But it comes with security trade-offs. Convenience and security are often in conflict with one another, and this is a case where there's some conflict. And so for high security use cases, you're going to want to keep those security keys, or maybe you want to keep that security key to secure your passkeys in the passkey vault. Other questions? Back over here.
Dean, thanks for your presentation. 2 questions, or I guess leading questions, if I may.
Sure.
The first is around UV caching and the little graph that's off passkeys.dev. Would you care to comment on things that operating system vendors could do, such as providing a pluggable credential manager, as is done on iPhone, on laptop operating systems, such that browser plugins that do UV caching wouldn't need to exist, and then the operating system could own that experience? That's one. Okay. And the other was related to your assertion that you might want to consider second factor with unattested passkeys, and I think PayPal's an example of a site that does this today. Do you want to comment too on the threat model associated with storing your second factor like TOTP secret alongside your passkey in the same password manager, and the fact that you might not actually be getting that benefit?
Sure, absolutely. So, so first of all, on the pluggable passkeys, or the pluggable passkey managers, that is an open-ended issue that we need better mechanisms for the third-party passkey providers, the Dashlanes, 1Passwords, et cetera, of the world, to be able to integrate with browsers on all of the operating systems. It is not yet an equal playing field on all the operating systems for all those pluggable passkey providers, and that is going to continue to be a problem into the future. Your second question about, yes, I'm going to store a TOTP next to my passkey, yeah, that would be a real problem, yet it's something that many people do. So in that case, you probably wouldn't want a TOTP, but you might want something else out of band, which, I know we all hate SMS OTP, but if you are in a multi-factor world and you want to retain that, then using a passkey when you don't know its properties may not be the right thing to do right now. And what I didn't say is you can also gain information on these kinds of properties through tools like MDM. Mobile device management would allow me to understand the context of the credential, how it's been provisioned on that device, the state of the device, etc., and may be used in place of attestation with passkeys to get that same level of assurance. And I know there are some others who are talking about that this week. Thanks, Shane. Sir in the back. So the question is, would it be better or more secure to keep them on a device, to have a device-bound passkey bound to a hardware device like a Windows machine in the TPM? The security model is better, yes, but the trade-offs are you wipe the machine, you reinstall the operating system, it's gone. And so now you struggle with backup and recovery. And so you've got to balance these risks, and depending on your threat model, that may be the right choice for you. But it may not be the right choice for your end users who may not have a machine with a TPM in it, for instance, or may not have multiple machines to have backups, etc. You're welcome. I think we're at time, so I need to